Greetings. This sermon is for my forgiveness, reconciliation, and healing class. It's the final project for that course, and it's about basically the stories of our lives. That's the title of it, and how those narratives intertwine with the narrative of God's mission in the world. So we'll start with a reading from the 8th chapter of the Gospel of John. Early in the morning, Jesus came to the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and he began to teach them. And the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And making her stand before all of them, they said to him, "Teacher, this is the woman who was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They said this to test Jesus, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. And Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And when the scribes and Pharisees kept on questioning him, Jesus straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once again he bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When they heard Jesus, they all went away, one by one, beginning with the elders. And Jesus was left alone with the woman before him. And Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again." This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise be to Christ. So it was a bright and sunny Sunday morning, and I was walking out of the sanctuary of my home church, and I noticed a man sitting on the benches by the front door. He looked a little worse for wear. His clothes were stained and wrinkled, his face was red and unshaven, and he had a small gathering of belongings all about him, all in plastic bags. And in the split second that I saw this man, I instantly made a judgment, one I am sure most of us are familiar with making. I decided that this man must be homeless, and I also decided that I must be on my guard. And I also took a moment to make sure that my wallet was secure in my back pocket. Oh, shoo! It was there, safe and secure. It's funny how that happens, isn't it? We notice a person's exterior, their clothes, their possessions, their physical appearance, and we react quickly by assigning a label, reducing their identity to a single thing, perhaps in a way that obscures their humanity. We see not just a man, but a homeless man. And then come the narratives that we craft around them, assumptions we automatically make. This homeless man must have done something wrong to end up in this way. He must have been fired from his job for some reason, perhaps stealing, perhaps for being negligent, perhaps for failing to show up on time. I mean, he must be darkening the doorway of our church for some reason. Maybe it's because he wants something from us, something that would be inconvenient and uncomfortable for us to give. And then there's this push inside, this sinister and driving feeling in me. I look at him and I decide, wow, he needs to leave. I'm not comfortable. I need to ask him what he wants that he will get out of here, and we can return to our safe and comfortable way of doing church on a Sunday morning. So all of these things played like tapes in my head when I saw this man that one day. Yet I decided to hold off on a few of my assumptions and cross the barrier of social expectations for just a moment. And I approached him, and I actually asked him his name. And I learned that he is Mike, and that he had come to our church this morning because he was too hot. Yes, he was homeless, and he was walking to the local mire for a job application. It was simply too hot to make it all the way in one journey. He needed rest, and he could use a ride. I did something that my insides screamed against. I said yes. So Mike gathered his belongings and hopped into my passenger seat, and before I knew it, we were on our way to Meyer, and we talked all the way. He told me about losing his job and fighting to apply for new positions without having reliable transportation. He told me about being kicked out of his mother's home and how he was hopeful that they would be able to reconcile someday. He told me that he believed in God, but he was doubtful whether God cared for someone like him. He wished for a sign of hope, something that showed that this was all worth it somehow. And by the end of the car ride, I realized I know more about Mike than I know about some of the people sitting in the pews of my home church. So we arrived at Meyer, and I wished Mike, hey, good luck. He picked up his things, thanked me, closed my car door, and entered the store, and I didn't see him for many months. That day I drove home in a state of wonderment about what had just occurred. It was like God had just encountered me in my daily life. The safe and cozy Sunday morning narrative of my life had just been interrupted by the story of Mike. A story of pain and neglect that somehow resonated with an unmistakable sense of optimism and promise. God had weaved our lives together in a meaningful experience, only then to take us on our separate ways, forever changed by an encounter neither one of us expected. And the tapes in my head, and this is important, they were proven false. I had nothing to fear from this fellow child of God, a man who needed just a little bit of help to be on his way. The narrative that I had created in my head for Mike was far removed from the encounter that God had orchestrated for us that morning, where I had assumed there must be a story of shame. God had revealed to me a story of grace, and it was amazing. So much of the Bible is like that, isn't it? Chance encounters where the stories of average, everyday people collide suddenly with the story of God. A story that certainly involves suffering and sorrow, but a story that always somehow leads to a creation of new life. In the academic and theological world, we might call these theophanies, visible manifestations of God to humankind. Moses' encounter with the burning bush is one. Isaiah's vision of God sitting up on a high and lofty throne is another. And if we can stretch the term theophany just a little bit, so is the entire life and ministry of Jesus Christ. You see, Jesus has a knack for showing up suddenly in unexpected places to dramatically alter humanity's life story, bringing us healing, freedom, a fresh new chance, and an abundance of love that subverts whatever social labels have us pinned down. In the end, our stories are defined not by what the world sees, but by what God sees in us. Someone worthy of forgiveness, someone who knows God, or someone who God knows by name, someone who is counted as an heir of God's promise of life everlasting, someone who is celebrated and cherished and embraced just as they are. You and me and everyone around us. With that in mind, I'd like to share a little bit about another story of God's grace, one that starts with rejection and peril, but ends in forgiveness, in what may well be a resurrection moment. The story of the woman Jesus refuses to condemn. So John 8 begins with what might seem like an average morning. Jesus goes to the temple in Jerusalem to sit with the people and teach them about God. Average day, right? But then that flow is disrupted when the scribes and Pharisees bring in a woman who has confessed to committing adultery. And she is forced to stand before Jesus and the entire gathering of people, stripped of her dignity and bodily autonomy. Notice that she has no name. No one is interested in hearing her story anymore. She isn't even permitted to speak. And all her many experiences and identities are whittled down to two labels: cheater and sinner. Dehumanized and rejected, she faces the ultimate penalty: death by stoning, a humiliating and torturous end to a life that has fallen into true darkness. But then, when we might have least expected it, the woman's story begins to turn. And that's because Jesus is there with her. After announcing the punishment that is required by law, the scribes and Pharisees make a mistake by asking Jesus a question. Now, what do you say, so-called Messiah, so-called Son of God? And this is a test of Jesus' ability to follow the law, one that he initially evades by remaining silent, specifically so that they can't force negative labels on him, that of a heretic and a blasphemer. But Jesus does not remain silent for long. After being prodded to give an answer and writing in the ground with his finger, Jesus says, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Now it is the crowd who is silent. And they are silent because they know the truth of what Jesus has just shared. We, those people who are in the crowd, I'm going to identify us with them. We mess up. We commit sin. We are not perfect. By the actual standards of the law, all of us should stand condemned for the things we have done in the past and the things that we're about to do. Not one of us can claim moral superiority over the other. We're all on that even plane. Not one of us is spotless. By the measure of the law, we are guilty. And yet, by the measure of God's grace, we are all forgiven over and over again and loved into new life. This is the part of the woman's story that Jesus reveals in that moment in the temple. A story that we might have expected was irretrievable. A silver lining of mercy, an undercurrent of hope, a motif of redemption in her narrative that has until now been completely unnoticeable. When the crowd disperses and all the accusations have ceased, Jesus asks her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? Where did they go?" And she replies, "No one, sir." And then Jesus declares something profound. "Neither do I. Neither do I condemn you." Everything is different now. Yes, the woman's story still contains hardship and pain, but now such suffering has been joined with a word of compassion and acceptance. Yes, her story still contains pages and chapters of bitterness and strife, but they now lead to an incredible new resolution, abounding in joy and hope. Yes, she is still wounded by the things that she has faced, but now she knows that those wounds can't keep her from the loving arms of Christ. Where once she stood condemned by the crowd. Now she stands forgiven and justified by Christ, the one who looked at her and said, "This is my child, my beloved one, and I will never condemn her." Dear ones, may you hear Jesus' words for you this morning. "Neither do I condemn you, neither do I shun you, neither do I reject you." Our lives' stories may be as winding and perilous as they come, but our entire existences no longer need to be defined by sin and shame. Sin does not have the final word when it comes to who we are and whose we are. Because God is saying to us, I know your faults, and guess what? I love you. I know your past, every nook and cranny, and I forgive you. I know all the scars that your body bears, and I weep with you for them. I know your guilt and your shame and your bitterness, and I release you from all of that. By the grace of God, our stories do not end at the cross of condemnation or in the tomb of death, but in the sunrise of the Easter morn, in the radiance of the risen Jesus, in the hope of the resurrection. But even as the died and resurrected Jesus recovers in our stories the truth that we are loved and accepted, we must be aware of how that same transformation occurs for the people around us. We must be on the lookout for the ways that the story of God collides with and disrupts the story of humanity in moments that we aren't going to expect. We must set down our stones, our assumptions, our judgments, and our fears, our homophobia, our sexism, our racism, ageism, ableism, the list goes on. We must set down those stones and cross over cultural boundaries to love our neighbors, to hear their life stories, and to discover how God is weaving our narratives together in this thing called life. Because when we assume what somebody's life story must be like, we are casting a stone. When we refuse to let them speak, when we speak over them, we are casting a stone. When we reduce their identities to a single label, we're casting a stone. Today and every day, may God exchange the words of rejection we speak and the stones of judgment that we throw for words of acceptance, actions of empathy, and gestures of love. May we in the church learn to say, my Savior didn't condemn you, and therefore neither do I. May we learn to mean it when we say that. Because it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to live it out. And may we learn to hold fast to our understanding of God's love, even when the crowds shout for the condemnation of those who are our neighbors. With that in mind, I think it's important to conclude by sharing how the story of Mike ends, or at least this little part of life that he and I shared. On another Sunday morning during worship, I was nudged on the shoulder by an usher who told me, hey, there's a guy out in the narthex and he's asking for you by name. Lo and behold, there was Mike. And he had some great news. I got the job. That's what he told me. And in his eyes, I saw hope and gratitude and freedom. And I saw how God had reauthored our stories, and I saw redemption not just for Mike, who had been so lost, but also for me, who had originally dared to judge this child of God in my heart. So as it turns out, the stories of our lives aren't always ours to write, are they? Sometimes we remember that God has been holding the pen all along, directing the movements of our story, adding in details and wonders, sprinkling them in that we aren't capable of imagining. Today, may we step back from the boundaries of culture and society and see in our stories and in the stories of people around us a sign of God's abundant grace, a grace that excludes none, a grace that loves all, and a grace that ushers in beautiful new life for all of God's children. Amen.